Informatics is right at the interface with human beings. How can we make all this technology useful for people? Amazing stuff happening with LLMs, with AI, with computation power. But what do we do with all that? A lot of work to be done in that middle space.
Welcome back to the AI Purity Podcast, the show where we explore the intersection of artificial intelligence and the pursuit of truth. I'm your host, Patricia, and today we have the privilege of featuring one of the faculty members from Indiana University Bloomington's Luddy School of Informatics, Computing, and Engineering. He is the author of the Personal Digital Resilience Handbook and the founder of Data2Discover and Konnex.AI. Our guest is not only a professor, author, and researcher, he is also a certified emergency medical technician. With a wealth of experience, over 100 research publications, and substantial funding accolades, today's guest brings a unique perspective to today's discussion. Join us as we delve into the fascinating world of informatics and the ethical implications of AI technologies. And welcome to the show, Professor David Wild.
Hi, Patricia. It's wonderful to be here.
Of course, we feel so honored to have you today. I'm going to get right into it. Please let us know how you got started as a professor at Indiana University and share us your journey into informatics and data technologies.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, if we really want to go back to the beginning, it all started when I was growing up in the 1980s in the UK, and there was the explosion of home computing at that point. Really exciting time in computing, and I just fell in love with computers and what they might be able to do. So I started writing code, learned different languages, and actually quite early on started a company selling utility software and other kinds of software for home computers. So this led me to a degree in computer science. And after my degree, I was kind of struggling as to how can I really have impact with these skills that I'm learning. And one thread through my whole life is like I really have to have somewhere that I'm kind of bringing some impact for people with what I'm doing. I'm not that theoretical a person. So I had the opportunity, Professor Peter Willett gave me the opportunity to do a PhD in computer-aided drug discovery. And this was just great for me. I could take my skills and apply them to this drug discovery, like discovering new drugs. What could be better than that? So I learned this whole new discipline. I worked in the pharmaceutical industry for several years, working with scientists, discovering new drugs. Then 2006, I was kind of ready for a shift of career, had the opportunity to come to Indiana University to start some new programs here. Ended up starting the data science program a little bit later on. And this also enabled me to kind of build a research kind of interest as well.
Amazing. So did you always know that you were going to, shift your computing degree into applying that to healthcare, for example, like drug discovery? And when did AI become integrated into that?
Yeah, well, when you get to my age, you feel obliged to have a really consistent narrative for your life. But really, there was a lot of real-time decision making going on. But I've always fallen in love with difficult problems that have, if they're solved, they have real impact for people. So that's really driven how I think about using my computing skills and my computing research. And that's really translated into AI as well. How can we use AI to make people's lives better, have positive impact for people and not negative impact?
And you were talking earlier about the research initiatives and the labs that you created at Indiana University. Please elaborate on those research initiatives, such as the Integrative Data Science Laboratory and the Crisis Technologies Innovation Lab.
Yeah, absolutely. So the Integrative Data Science Lab, one of the interesting things about data science is we tend to really silo the work that we do. So we maybe have a list of customers for a particular company with some properties, and we try and learn something or do something predictive with that one data set. Or we have a data set of how drugs in the body respond to one protein. So we do a lot of work on these very siloed data sets. Particularly a lot of the harder problems in the world can't be reduced down to one data set or one very small silo that require understanding from many different places. So the Integrative Data Science Lab is focused on these complex problems and how we can actually connect data sets and connect very different kinds of data to find solutions to these big problems. And the core one for that lab is healthcare and drug discovery. Now, our bodies are pretty complicated and very connected. So can we bring that connectedness into the world of data? So we use things like graph technologies and computation on top of graphs and various other methods that let us integrate and map the relationships between data. The Crisis Technologies Innovation Lab came from a little bit of a different source. It actually came out of my frustration because I think you mentioned I'm an EMT, and for over 14 years, I've been going out on ambulance runs to patients. And there was a complete disconnect. In my day job, I was playing with all these cool AI tools. I'd go out on an ambulance run, I'm kind of writing things on my glove. There's just no effective use of technology. Same for emergency management, which is related discipline for larger incidents. So I had a long-standing passion to bring these two worlds together. And that really came together in 2019 when I created the Crisis Technologies Innovation Lab, literally dedicated to how can we use these more advanced technologies to help first responders, emergency managers, and people trying to help us all keep safe.
Can you tell us a little about the history of how you got started as an EMT? Did that come first or your degree in computing?
No, definitely definitely the degree in computing came first. Although even from being a kid, I've loved kind of, the action of of emergency response. But it was in 2010, I just kind of decided I spend all my time in front of a computer. I want to kind of do something a little more exciting and direct impact as well. So I trained as an EMT and I loved it. Like just going out immediately, somebody really needs some help and you've got some tools to help them. And I just really like that kind of dynamic. Plus, it just got me into this world of people who do a very different job than I do. So I could start to understand, some of how technology might help.
And David, you created two companies. You're the founder of Data2Discovery and Konnex.AI. Could you tell us a little bit more about how these companies got started, what they're all about, and how do they contribute to solving complex problems in healthcare and information management?
Yeah, absolutely. So Data2Discovery actually emerged from research I did at Indiana University jointly with Professor Ying Ding. We actually discovered some ways to be able to integrate lots of different kinds of data about chemical compounds, proteins, different biological pathways in the body, and then compute on top of that, that we could actually get some insights and predictions that we couldn't get using other methods, particularly, for instance, potential side effects of drugs or toxicology of drugs, or just whether drugs are going to be effective or not, and which kinds of drugs could be effective. So we actually had kind of customers waiting in the pharmaceutical industry who were telling us, can we get access to this stuff, right? And it was in a research lab at the time. So we actually formed the company out of necessity, if you like, that we had people in industry really wanting this. So we've actually spent almost a decade building this internal stack of data and technologies that let us compute and help with drug discovery. So, now we're really a pretty mature AI for drug discovery company. Most of our work is we partner with pharmaceutical companies to apply these methods to their problems. So we essentially a services company right now, but we've actually used the stack internally. We just recently discovered a potential new drug for a disease called Mycobacterium abscessus, which is a particularly unpleasant skin disease, which affects children with cystic fibrosis. There's no cure. We don't know if it's going to be a drug yet, but we have early signs that this could be helpful. Konnex.AI, again, is very different. This came out of the emergency management space. Particularly, I saw this recurring problem that as we get this explosion of information in the world and information sources, it becomes increasingly difficult to bring it all together in a way that's kind of actionable. So if you just think about news sources, we used to, back in my day, we used to just read the newspaper and maybe you'd read two newspapers, but now we all have like 5,000 sources on Reddit and on, different newspapers and Twitter. And it's a huge amount of work just trying to go through it all and get all the information you want. Now, for people in critical decision-making roles, this is important. Like if we miss a couple of news stories, nobody's going to die. But there's people in critical decision-making roles, emergency managers, first responders, all kinds of senior decision makers, particularly, who, if they miss something, something bad could happen. So there's this been kind of problem that people don't have time to spend going through all these sources to be able to, get information, summary information together and make decisions. If you want to solve that problem, you normally get somebody to write you a briefing or report. You pay a consultant to go out and do that, but not everybody can afford it. The president can afford it. The president has a presidential daily briefing, but the president only has that because they can have a huge number of people putting it all together. What Konnex.AI does is uses AI to automate that process of creating reports and briefings. So you can have a daily briefing or briefing as much as you need. You get to choose the sources, have hundreds of sources it comes from, but it gets summarized down into a really easy to digest briefing that a human being can read. So it's solving this information overload problem that people have.
That's really fascinating. So I guess the inspiration for founding Data2Discovery was, like you said, born out of the necessity, and I guess it does streamline the creation and drug discovery. Would you share with us the unique contributions that the company has brought to AI-driven drug discovery that distinguishes it from the traditional approaches?
Yeah, it's really about accelerating. So a lot of the work that we've done that I can't talk about because it was with pharmaceutical companies behind the scenes is essentially just speeding up the processes. It can take up to 15 years to bring a drug to market. It's from the early science, the early biology and chemistry through to actually getting that drug into patients. And often 4, 5, 6 years of research and development has to be done to get that drug to market. Now, as we used to say in the Park Davis, the pharmaceutical company where I worked, the patient is waiting, right? If it's a serious disease, the patient might be dying, and they've got to wait 6 years for us to do this thing. So can we accelerate that? Can we speed up some of these processes so that we can get the drugs into patients and clinical trials and out to market faster? So that's the real contribution of what we've got. Being able to speed up that process, get the world of information and what might be possible to this chemical compound, this drug interacts with this target to produce this effect in humans. And that's really what we're trying to do.
Well, could you share with us some more other examples or successful applications or case studies where Data2Discovery's technology has significantly improved healthcare research or patient outcomes? I mean, you said earlier 5 or 6 years before drugs hit the market. Has that time been shortened so far?
Yeah, so the example where we actually internally discovered this potential drug ourselves, that process that we went through with our AI stack would normally have at least taken a year, possibly a couple of years. We literally went from asking the early questions through to having that clear signal that yes, these 2 or 3 compounds could be really interesting. It's embarrassing to say, but we had it in a couple of days. Now, it took a little bit of time to do the real, what we call wet lab experiments, getting real scientists to do the real experiments with the real drug to confirm this. That took us a couple of months. In a drug company, that could have been a little bit quicker. But the whole process was maybe 2 months instead of a year for that discovery. And so that's, we still don't know if that drug will get to market, but that's kind of example of the time reduction that we can get.
Oh, that's amazing. And talking about Konnex.AI, what were the market needs or gaps that you identified that led to the development of this automated reporting solution?
Yeah, I mean, what actually happened was it was 2016. I saw the problem that people needed just a briefing, reports, summary. There was this, like several people I knew in emergency management expressed this to me, that if I could only just have something which brought it all together in one place. And I tried to do it manually. Once I had a subscription service where once a week I would do like a national product that says nationally, here are the things that might want to be watched in terms of emergency events. This week, it could be tornadoes, it could be hurricanes, it could be earthquakes, or earthquakes tend to be after, but volcanoes, it could be solar weather, it could be cybersecurity events. And it was really popular. We had a couple of hundred paying subscribers. But I was taking half my weekend to do this, and people really wanted customized for them and they wanted it daily. So it wasn't, I just couldn't do that. So it was kind of on hold until generative AI came along. And then I asked the question, wait a minute, we might be able to automate this process. So we did some kind of testing and kind of validated that we could do this. And then we had a beta test group of 60 responders and emergency managers, all of whom loved it. And now we're just at the point that we're kind of, onboarding customers and actually getting this out to people so they can use it in their daily jobs.
And are there any other specific industries besides emergency response sectors where Konnex.AI's technology has been particularly impactful in streamlining information processing and decision-making processes?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So we're still very early stage. We only formed the company in May 2023. So we're still discovering where the real value is for people. But we are getting some interesting signals. One, for instance, is in competitive intelligence and business intelligence. So again, is the same problem. If you want to know what your competitors are doing, there's a huge amount of information sources. And if we can aggregate and summarize and organize that information, bring it together into briefings, it could be valuable. And really any place where people have to make, critical decisions based on a large amount of information which is spread around different sources, we can see some value in this. But we're just really exploring that right now. So maybe come back to me in a year and I'll give you a better answer.
Sure, I'll ask that again in a couple years, baby. Well, you were talking about, how AI is being applied and leveraged into these companies. Can you provide us some more insight into how exactly AI is used within the healthcare industry, and what are the specific applications or use cases you've shown promise in improving patient care and outcomes?
This is a really great question again. And I think healthcare is one of the industries and areas where potentially AI could have the biggest impact. And I think that the first thing I would say is there are hundreds, maybe even thousands of very specific places where AI can help. Now, this is not new. We tend to use AI for generative AI like ChatGPT, but really the full breadth of AI with predictive modeling goes back decades. And we've seen at different points in healthcare, the area I worked in, computer-aided drug discovery, back in the 1990s, we were doing pretty advanced predictions based on data. But some examples, the obvious one is analyzing X-rays, that we can have this kind of assistant to a human in analyzing X-rays and looking for kind of red flags and signs. Another is in patient care and essentially having a second opinion. So having a chatbot or something, just kind of listening into a doctor-patient conversation. If you kind of think about it, a doctor, there's nothing like a good doctor in helping you get well when you're sick, right? If you have a good doctor, that's what you need. And the AI bot isn't going to replace the doctor. The AI bot isn't going to be, able to understand your humanness and relate to you as a human, all of which is massively important in patient recovery. But again, the last time I checked, there's PubMed, which is the kind of repository of medical publications. I think the last 2022, the 1.7 million medical papers came out, 1.7 million. So let's say you're a doctor in a particular field, and let's just be conservative and say maybe you need to be on top of the information in 1% of those, right? So 17,000 papers a year. That means you have to read 50 papers a day to stay on top of the research that's going on, as well as see all your patients. That's not going to happen. No doctor is going to be able to read and digest 50 papers a day. But a computer can read and digest millions of papers a day. So, there's different strengths and weaknesses. So the doctor might not be on top of all that research, but the AI is. And the AI might not be on top of just being able to get this picture of like something wrong with this human and we don't know what's going on, but I can feel it, or this, based on my experience, this. But so together they could really, really provide much better patient care. But they're really, I think we're just going to see bubbling up these hundreds, maybe thousands of very specific applications. I think as we get further down the line, there's some really interesting possibilities that, I don't want to sound Silicon Valley hype, but I think it is possible that we might be able to, if a computer can read all the research that's out there, maybe they can identify some insights into cancer or diabetes or other diseases that no human has actually seen just because they haven't had access to all this information. So I think there's some, I'd like to think 5, 10 years from now, maybe AI can help us at least advance treatment for some of these really horrible kind of, difficult diseases.
That's really fascinating. And you were talking earlier about, some people, when they think of AI, they just know generative AI like ChatGPT. And we now know that it's not always accurate. And, it all depends on the type of data that you feed into these AI models. Like you said earlier, I mean, a doctor is not going to be able to read all 50 research papers in like a span of, how many years, but AI can. How accurate would you say, the condensed data that AI tells you about these data that you feed into it? Because obviously like you're using it for healthcare and there are really important information that there are no gaps basically that you can't miss anything, which is why you're needing AI to help. How accurate is the data? Is that anything that you guys are, how does the checks and balances take place into that?
Yeah, well, I think it really is a checks and balances thing. So it's a trade-off, right? This machine has, read 50 million research papers, but there may be some basic things it doesn't understand that we humans understand. So it could really completely misunderstand. Well, it doesn't understand, it just completely
Mhm.
misrepresent something. And that certainly does happen. And, the old adage, to err is human, to really screw things up requires a computer. Humans do make mistakes and humans make bad mistakes, but computers can make mistakes at a whole different scale, right? So that's certainly a concern. And the way it's usually presented is the idea of AI hallucinating, like at least with generative AI, they kind of just comes up with complete nonsense that sounds plausible. However, I think humans sometimes come out with complete nonsense that sounds plausible. In fact, I might be doing that right now, um, so I think it's, for me, on balance, there are, definitely ways, even just with ChatGPT, there are ways of prompt engineering that at least reduce the risk that you're going to get a completely terrible result out. You can even tell it, I really care that these results are accurate. So if you don't know what the answer is, just tell me you don't know what the answer is or something. So there are ways to kind of reduce the risk of that kind of hallucination. A good example of this is Konnex.AI, where we're presenting information to people who make critical decisions, right? We don't want to get this wrong. So we put a lot of work into making sure we're not sending them complete nonsense, but we're sending them something approximating reality. But we do have checks and balances. And one of them is for everything we present to a human, we have a link. And that link goes back to the source documents that we use to create that summarization. So we always recommend to people, if you're going to make a decision on something we present, click on that link and check out the source documents. Because a lot of the value here is that 99% of the information we consume, I don't know if it's 99%, but a lot of the information we consume isn't relevant to us, but we want to find the 1 or 2 bits that are relevant to us. And when you find them, it's reasonable to spend some time validating that with source documents. But we don't want to have to use those source documents for everything, right? So that's one example. And I think there are good emerging ways that we can just have those, it's a research area, it's a developing area, having those checks and balances and being able to use AI carefully and well.
Thank you for that. That definitely like clears a little bit more about this research area for me. And you were talking earlier about Konnex AI, and I wanted to ask for, more examples about how AI technology is being integrated into emergency response and management systems to enhance preparedness and coordination, especially, during a crisis.
Yeah, absolutely. So the term that's used most widely is situational awareness. So situational awareness means you kind of know what's going on. And really important in situational awareness is everybody everybody within a particular scope having access to the same information, so they're making decisions based on the same understanding of a situation. So let's say there's, so emergency manager really does 4 different jobs, and they're called preparation, mitigation, response, and recovery. So preparation is helping prepare for future incidents. So putting a stockpile of food will be a preparation. Mitigation is actually taking steps to reduce the impact or probability of future events. So putting a smoke alarm in your house is a mitigation step. Response is something bad happens anyway, and you have to try and sort out the mess and trying to get us, save lives and save injuries, save buildings, and try and get us back to something like normality. And then recovery is getting back to normal after an incident. If the incident's really big, the recovery can take years. We're still in recovery technically from Hurricane Katrina in 2004. So each of these stages, there's different needs, right? So for instance, if you think about preparation and mitigation, think of us here in Bloomington, Indiana. What do we as a community need to do to prepare for the future? Well, we need data for that. We need to know what the risks are, what's the risk of a tornado versus an earthquake? Well, I don't know, but we could probably find an answer to that. And, what steps have other people done that help reduce the impact of those things if they do happen? Now, there's thousands of Bloomingtons all gathering information and making decisions right independently. So if we can actually share that information and enable people to quickly come up with their own plans and preparation plans and mitigation plans without having to put huge amounts of work in themselves, then that's a big win for everybody. We can be more prepared with less boring human work to be done. And the same with response and recovery. When something bad happens, how do we just get the right information so that everybody knows what's going on? We can, know what's just happened. What does that mean? And what's likely to happen next are the key pieces. And again, it's about having access to all the right information. So I think there's, again, a broad set of applications. To be honest, when we tend to think of AI, it's really easy to think of the really exciting things like, we're using Apple Vision Pro goggles to get 3D environments or something. But a lot of the highest value applications are just really boring stuff, helping people fill out forms, prepare plans, doing the tedious. Nobody becomes an emergency manager because they want to spend all day writing documents, right? So can we help them with the boring stuff so the human can do the exciting stuff?
And what would you say are some of the challenges or limitations associated with integrating AI technologies into these industries? And how are researchers and practitioners working to address these obstacles?
So there's always a barrier to introducing new technologies into particularly an environment that's not a technology-rich environment, right? And so, I come up with some random new technology that can help with, hotel management or something, right? There's a barrier to kind of, well, how is this better than what I've got so far? What can it do for me? There's the cost of actually shifting over to this new technology. Things are going to go wrong with it. So you really have to there's a lot of work involved in introducing new technology. With generative AI, we have a head start because literally almost everybody in the universe is messing around with ChatGPT. So everybody is starting to ideate about how generative AI might help with their job or their thing. And so the plus is that a normal big challenge of trying to identify that middle space where the technology can really solve a problem for somebody, real problem for somebody in their job, has been made much easier because those people in their jobs already know something about the technology and are ideating about how it could help them. Right? So that's a big plus, right? Huge plus. And I think the challenges specific to AI are a few. Firstly, that people know they should be doing AI because everybody else is doing AI and we've got to do AI. But there's concerns that it could do something, but something bad could happen. How can we trust this thing that's a machine, right? And maybe we can trust the humans who know how this machine works a bit better. So again, with Konnex.AI, we do employ real experts in AI who can, are trustworthy people. And so they can help us trust that something bad isn't going to happen here. But it's a really valid concern, right? The other is what happens to my data? Like, is somebody going to get access to all my data if we're using OpenAI and so on? The answer is, well, kind of yes. But, so we're now starting to look at very kind of closed system large language models where you're not sharing your data with somebody else. And I think, probably the big one for everybody is this AI just going to replace me? Like, am I out of a job? It's a big concern because there are going to be jobs lost because of AI. There's absolutely no doubt about that. But if people want to have a job, then a really good way to try and have job security is to understand how to apply AI into your line of work, because then you're not just having this bot come along and replace you. You're a high value person, because it's not obvious what the value. You have to understand the field and understand AI to understand how it can really help, right? So if you have that kind of expertise and you know how to marshal bots so that one person can do 100 times more effective, for instance, then that's going to be good for you. So that's a slightly concerning answer, I know, because then it's kind of like, well, there's winners and losers there. There's people who kind of are able to use the AI and people who can't. But there's no getting around the fact there's going to be a big shift happen in the workforce, and that different from when computing and the internet came along. People are going to have to adapt around that. So that is a concern.
That's really interesting. And we'll get into generative AI later on. We were talking more about like the importance of data and the importance of information, especially when it comes to, making strides in innovation for healthcare and emergency response. So, David, I'd want to ask you, like, how would you define informatics and what distinguishes it from related fields such as computer science and data science?
So I'm remembering back to when I first started Indiana University in 2006, and I was at a gas station, and somebody came up to me at the gas station and said, I had a IU Informatics on my car, and said, my daughter just started informatics. What the hell is informatics? And I had no answer. I was like, I don't actually know. I'm going to find out. But here's the way I characterize it is, data science is all about data, how we can use data, how we can predict with data, how we can manage data. Computer science is about how we, these machines incredibly we've been able to build over the last few decades that can do this computation. How do we program them? How do we build them? How do we get them to do things that are useful? Informatics is right at the interface with human beings. So it's about how can we make all this technology useful for people. And if you look at what we do in informatics, really that's the common thread through everything. So we have really broad set of people. We have anthropologists looking at the societal impacts of computing. We have animal informatics, what we can learn from animals about the use of technology and how we can actually have technology that helps animals. Complex systems looking at how, for instance, flu pandemics spread. We have human-computer interaction, which is understanding that interface with the human. We have human-robot interaction, which is how humans and robots can interact, right? So really informatics is that kind of space between the technology and human beings. And we're finding increasingly that's where the action is, because there's obviously amazing stuff happening with what we might call foundational technologies, with LLMs, with AI, with computation power. But what do we do with all that? And there's a lot of work to be done in that middle space.
In your information, David, why is the study of informatics significant, especially in today's digital age with the increasing prevalence of generative AI technologies?
Yeah, well, I think humans and computers are now interacting 24/7, right? We're on our phones, we're kind of on ChatGPT asking questions. So it's not like a question of some kind of theoretical question. It's like this is happening now in real time. There's a complete fusion between the machine doing things and us doing things, and we're influencing each other. So this makes, an urgency in understanding, just, is social media bad for us? Well, we don't really know. Like it's too soon to tell, but let's research some stuff. Are certain kinds of people more able to adapt to certain kinds of technologies than others? Well, let's find out. Historically, universities can be sometimes quite siloed, where there's psychology over here, there's engineering or chemistry over here, and then there's this other newer thing called computer science over here, right? To do this stuff in the middle, you got to break down those silos. You need psychologists, you need social scientists, you need computer scientists all working together. So what kind of built at Indiana University is this space where, we can have these people with different disciplines all coming together to understand. And there's been some like amazing heated arguments between, anthropologists and the computer scientists, in our meetings, but they're great. We're really working things out. The pace of change of technology, we can easily think every problem is a new problem. So we're now ethics, like what do we do with this AI, is somehow this new problem we hadn't anticipated, and we've got to deal with it urgently. Well, it turns out if you're a social scientist, or political scientist, or many other kinds of non-computer people, there's a whole bunch of work went on in the 1950s, the 1960s, 70s. We've been thinking about this problem as human beings for a very long time. And so there's a lot of work we can go on. So when you get a social scientist talking to a computer scientist, these things kind of come out.
And how do you see the field of informatics evolving in response to the rapid advancements in generative AI? And what new challenges and opportunities does this present for researchers and practitioners across many industries?
Yeah, speaking personally, the biggest challenge is the speed and cadence of academia relative to the speed and cadence of the technology. If the classic way of me researching something is, I have an idea, I submit a grant application to the NSF, maybe they take several months up to a year to review it, and then they kind of, yes, great, I get this grant. This enables me to hire a PhD student who I then need to kind of train for a year, and then they can do some research, and they'll research for a few years, and we'll publish it in a journal. It takes a year to publish in a journal. That time frame is just not going to work here, because anything we publish on generative AI, for instance, right now, needs to get out there tomorrow. It can't get out 5 years from now because it'd be completely irrelevant. So, we as academics have got to find some way to at least condense down that cycle from kind of research to impact, or research to dissemination of knowledge. And there's plenty of ways to do that. Fortunately, there's kind of ways to publish nowadays, even if it's on Substack or something, but there's ways to get research out there quickly now. And it's a little more challenging to get the actual research moving faster. But I think the key there is actually getting academia, industry, and other entities, to, foundations, whatever, to be working closer together on some of these, big problems that we need to solve. I think if we can do that, we are going to see, the other kind of challenge in academia is all the big exciting developments have actually come from industry, not directly from academia, maybe indirectly. But OpenAI didn't come out of a university directly, right? So, things are happening that are taking us all by surprise in academia. So we have to be a little more reactive in our research as well.
Earlier, you were talking about how AI could potentially, impact job security for, different industries that don't integrate AI into their sectors. What would you say are some of the key skills or competencies that students today or, studying informatics should develop to effectively engage with generative AI technologies in their applications?
Yeah, another great question. And my answer is maybe going to be slightly controversial. So usually when people give an answer to this, they'll say something like, they'll reel off a list of skills, like, and it might be something like Java programming, or it could be, statistics, or machine learning. And all those are great skills to learn. but they're not the critical skills in getting a job or bringing value because they change so quickly, partly. Two reasons. One, they change too quickly, and two, we never quite know when one of those skills is going to be replaced by a machine. So coding, being a Java programmer 5 years ago sounded like a really safe bet. Now it's like, oh, I think I could do this on ChatGPT. I don't really need a Java programmer. Just stepping back, what are the key abilities that humans can have which help bring value from technology to people? And now value could be in a company, helping the company build products or solve problems, or doctors be able to cure people and that kind of thing. And the answer really are some of the much more human things. And the first one is curiosity. And I always say to my students, the first skill you should develop, if you don't already have lots of it, is curiosity. And it's really easy when you're in academic environments. How do I get an A in this class? How do I, do the things I need to do to get the piece of paper at the end? And that works against curiosity, because curiosity takes you on kind of random walks and journeys. That's like, I wonder why it's not possible to do this thing. Why is my professor telling me that we can do this thing, but we can't do this other thing? Let's go off and find out and try some things out. It's an experimental thing. But if you can have curiosity, I think you're going to be happier and enjoy what you're doing more, and also be able to develop an approach which can be a problem-solving approach and identifying problems that need to be solved. And the second is agility, which is easier for some people than others, just based on how some people it's really hard to change and be agile, and other people it's a lot easier. But wherever you're at on that spectrum, being able to get a couple of steps closer to agile. Like, by agile, I mean, I'm a Java programmer, but it looks like Python's kind of becoming more popular. So let's learn Python. Can you make these adaptive state shifts in response to how the technology is developing? And the third skill is creativity. And that's what's interesting. I have talked to several employers who are actually hiring people who at least have undergraduate degrees in things like music, art, not the kinds of degrees you'd think people will be having going into technology, but people who have those creative backgrounds can think more creatively about problems, and the actual technical skills can be added on more easily later. But those basic creative thinking approaches lawyers as well, like the training to be a lawyer is a great training for problem solving. It's like, that critical thinking, creativity. So, and then just finding the thing that you really care about. And this gets back to maybe the curiosity as well. But, there's so much possibility out there. There's an infinite amount of things where value could be brought by bringing technology together with some kind of problem. You don't have to go into accounting. You don't have to go into healthcare, emergency management. Go to the thing that you're really interested in and care about, and deep dive on that and see where you can get to. And maybe it doesn't work out, but in that process of deep diving, it'll give you an experience you can then transfer over somewhere else. So that was maybe not a specific kind of response, but that is really what I feel, that building those curiosity, creative skills, agility is really important.
I think that's really great insight. Definitely something really valuable and actually a more realistic answer, if I'm being honest. Well, David, given your extensive experience in various domains of AI research and application, how do you approach the ethical considerations inherent in the development and deployment of AI technologies?
So I had a kind of mental light bulb moment a few years ago when I was actually co-teaching a course on data science ethics with my colleague at the time, Eden Medina. She's now at MIT, and she's a computing historian. So her research is all about the history of computing, and with a particular interest in ethics. And she opened up to me all this work that's been done for decades, really interesting work on ethics, what ethical frameworks, what different kinds of ethical frameworks, which helped me understand that there's no easy answers to anything, but there are frameworks that are well established that help you understand what the different answers might be and maybe help you figure out which one applies in this particular situation. So an example might be, there's a framework called the utilitarian framework, which is you're trying to do the most good for the most people, but understanding that in doing that, some people might be harmed somehow, or some people might not get access to that good. Another is a duty-based framework where you have a duty to act. So like a doctor has a duty to act in a certain ethical way with a patient, and sometimes that's written into agreements or law, and that's a different kind of thing. Those might be in conflict. The utilitarian might get you to a different place than the duty-based. So just be awareness of those different frameworks and doing some research on ethics in general, and then ethics in AI and technology. I think everybody should do. Even if you should do this, but you can ask ChatGPT to tell you about some of the history. I don't know how well that would work. But so I think, it's not like we're just floating at sea without any kind of direction. There's a long body of history to help us look out for the mines in the minefield, and also the kind of opportunities to make sure that we do the best we can in bringing good with technology and not bringing harm. The other thing I'd say is a lot of these questions are somewhat out of our control. Should ChatGPT exist, or LLMs exist at all? Should they be regulated? Most of us are not really going to have any input into that question, the answer to that question. Some of us might, but mostly it's going to be, given the situations it stands today, how can I do something good here and be very careful about not doing some harm? And almost all of us are having these kind of questions coming up every day. So for me as an academic, how can I teach and evaluate my students in a way which acknowledges this elephant in the room, that there's this machine over here that everybody can access, which gives perfect answers to any question I might give as an assignment. What can I do about that? Well, there's things I can do. And certainly I could do like a rule-based thing where I say anybody who uses ChatGPT is going to be so severely punished that you're not going to want to risk it, right? Or I could use a tool that helps me understand. So I'm going to use this tool, just want you all to know, so be aware. I could change my assignments around the fact that ChatGPT exists. And that's actually the one I've used most often. So for instance, it's pushed me more towards in-person group discussions and then evaluating people's engagement in those group discussions instead of having a term paper where they have to write an essay on something. In some ways, ethics, we sometimes think of ethics as in these very kind of grand terms, like should they exist or not? But for me, it's in the micro decisions that we're making every day about how do I help my students be successful in life, given the fact that a lot of the things I used to get them to do can be automated now, right? And there's lots of different answers to that question.
It's really great that you talk about, the ethical implications of using large language models like ChatGPT in classrooms specifically. I wanted to get your take about what do you think of AI text detection tools like AI Purity? Is this something that you would be open to using in your classroom specifically? Is it something you feel safe for your students to use?
Yeah, absolutely. I'm really encouraged that AI Purity and companies like AI Purity really starting to tackle this problem, right? And we are at an early stage, and so we've got this weird thing going on where we have the piece of text, and then we have a human that maybe is claimed to write this text, and then a machine which evaluates this text. But it's a kind of cat and mouse game, right? So I can, at some point I can say, write me an essay that has a few errors in it, so it doesn't sound like it comes from AI, and then the AI detection has to adapt to that and figure out, what did it look like when a ChatGPT is trying not to sound like ChatGPT. At some point, we're going to really the question isn't so much was this written on ChatGPT or wasn't it. The question is more what's real and what isn't real. That's probably the most important question here. So we've seen, as a Brit, I've seen all this in the news about the British royal family putting out a picture of Princess Kate, and it turns out it was photoshopped, and was it even real anyway? Then it's like, well, there's a video. Was that deep faked or was it not deep faked? And I've seen instances where people have actually written a article themselves, but everybody thinks it sounds like ChatGPT. So it seems that, so there's all this stuff going on, and just getting the signal out of the noise. I'm sure that the internet is being flooded, particularly with, automatically generated text content right now. And we're not going to get into a good place at all if we just get into a cycle where, AI is learning from content that it generated a year ago or something. So, just being able to get signal out of noise, reality out of non-reality, and clear thinking out of just background kind of meaningless words, I think is what I care most about. And then the problem of, was it ChatGPT or not? In some ways, the question there for me is there new thinking here behind this, and sometimes did this human come up with this new thinking? So if I have a really good idea, like I've got a really good thought, but I'm dyslexic, I'm not very good at writing, and I have helped ChatGPT help me express that thought in a way that other people can understand. Is that a bad thing? I think probably not. If a student wants to go out drinking and doesn't want to learn about this really important topic that I think they really need to know if they're going to be successful in life, and so they just fire something off on ChatGPT and hand it in, is that good? No, I don't think so. I mean, they're going to miss out on this really important, what I think is a really important thing they need to know. So, there's difference. Again, it's not just ChatGPT or not ChatGPT. It's, are we getting something of value here or not getting something of value?
That's really great, David. And I think it's like really relevant and important to have these types of discussions, especially now with generative AI. I don't think a lot of people are, aware of just how much it impedes on their own, privacy and data security. So I wanted to talk about your book and wanted to ask you what inspired the Personal Digital Resilience Handbook. What is the message and the mission here? And how does one become digitally resilient?
Wonderful questions again. So this again has arose out of a concern that I saw, particularly as I was building the data science program at Indiana University. I got to meet with all these companies that were vacuuming up information about us and integrating it and making scores, and it opened my eyes to, we think, you go into a store and you kind of buy something and they ask for your phone number, and we think, oh, they just want the phone number so they can have a look at it, but it's getting vacuumed up through 20 levels and integrated with other stuff. And this, may be okay, but so many things can go wrong with this. And one of the biggest concerns I see right now is, if you think, what Maslow's hierarchy is, this kind of hierarchy of needs, that, basic needs like eating, sleeping, and breathing air, up to these kind of more kind of high level human needs like relationships and meaning in life. And it feels like over the last decade or so, we've kind of moved our Maslow's hierarchy of needs onto the cloud. So, everything we do is in this environment that makes us vulnerable in multiple ways. It's not just that, the data sharing is a huge vulnerability, that we've lost control of all this personal information about us. But it's also the fact that we're reliant on systems that somebody else is controlling. So, the obvious one is a bank. If you stuff your money into a mattress, then it's safe in the sense that you completely control it, but it's not safe in that your house catches fire and somebody breaks in and you lose it, right? The bank has all this security, but then they control it. So if the bank doesn't want to give you your money, you kind of don't have your money. So there are these kind of tensions between, what I lay out in the book are privacy, security. So how can I keep my data private? It's not about what do I have to hide, but what do I have to protect? I want to protect this information. Security, how do I just keep my stuff secure? It's like the equivalent of the lock on the front of their house. And so we get into, password managers and how to use two-factor authentication, just basic steps, not identifying phishing emails. Let's not let something bad happen to break into my information. And then control. How do we actually have control over the stuff that we think we might have control of, but actually somebody else does? And an obvious one there is file sharing. Yes, we can give Dropbox all our data, but there are ways to actually share your data between machines where you completely control the environment, so that if something bad happens and the internet goes down, you can still access your stuff. Or Google decides it doesn't like you anymore, closes your account, you still have your stuff because it's on a backup somewhere. So the book was actually meant as just a really, really practical set of steps the ordinary person can take to secure your phone, secure your computer, have internet usage in ways that you're not just giving out all your information to everybody all the time, and just at least have some basic kind of hygiene and security around the use of technology to mitigate some of those basic risks. Now, we do have an advanced section where we're going to threat modeling and some other things, but I had a lot of people in my life who were really struggling with phishing emails, and did I get hacked? And then I'm getting these phone calls from people saying it's my bank, and is it my bank? And if you're not completely on top of this, it's just a completely horrendously confusing environment. So helping people who, I've spent all my career in computing, so I kind of vaguely know what's going on. But for people who haven't done that, what things can they do very simply to kind of get some control back and get a little bit of protection back?
That's really fascinating. And I honestly urge everyone who's listening to this podcast to read your book and learn how they can protect their data especially in today's digital age. And just one last question, David, before I let you go today. As AI continues to evolve, what future trends or developments do you anticipate in terms of its applications and impact across healthcare, drug discovery, emergency response, risk assessment, and cybersecurity?
Great question. And I hesitate to give an answer because, this particularly generative AI is constantly surprising us with what is possible in particular, but some of the constraints as well. I think just thinking 5 or 10 years into the future, I think it's clear that certainly for the Western world, we're entering a phase of the world which has less stability than we've maybe been used to. And there are numerous reasons: climate change, political instability. But one of them is, economic changes and the impact of technology on that, on economics. So I think life is actually getting more complicated, and there's more uncertainty in all our lives. Like, will I be able to pay my rent a year from now? Will I have a job a year from now? Should I get remote work somewhere else? There's hugely increased number of options, but a hugely increased amount of uncertainty. So for me, a big value of AI in that is helping us navigate that new world we're entering in, where there's new hazards, new risks, new opportunities, and huge amounts of information about all those things. So the information explosion is kind of unabated. So think of ourselves, you and me, 5 years from now. I anticipate there's going to be even more information all over that might be relevant to us. We're going to have more uncertainty happening, and we are going to have to find a way to be able to navigate that in a meaningful way. So the idea of an AI assistant that can just help us, each of us personally can have 1,000 assistants to go out and figure all this stuff out and help us navigate our lives. For me, that's the primary, because that really is the core of everything else, right? So, if healthcare, well, that's a me question. If I get sick, how do I get better? Is the answer. That's all that healthcare helps prevent me getting sick in the first place, but if I do get sick, helps me get better as quickly as possible. That's all really healthcare is, right? So how can I have really good healthcare? Well, maybe the disruption isn't so much within the healthcare system itself, better X-ray reading stuff, all that's good stuff. But maybe there's a more fundamental change in how I stay healthy and don't get sick. And if I do get sick, I get better, right? So I feel like, the optimist in me says that we'll find a way for this AI and technology to finally serve us as real human people, all of us equally valuable, right? It's not serving an institution. We found a way for it to serve us each as a person in the community and be able to kind of navigate this instability that we've maybe got in the world in a much better way. So all kinds of things could go wrong, but the optimist in me says we'll maybe find out how we can be really human in the midst of all this technology and enjoy the fact that we get to be human with, the machines doing all this boring stuff and all this necessary stuff for us to be able to be the best humans we can be. So yeah, so I am an optimist, even though I write books on bad things happening. So.
I think that's important to stay an optimist. And David, before you go, would you like to share any message? You want to say anything to our audience today before you go?
I think I've probably said everything that's on my brain, but wonderful to have this opportunity and answer these really great questions, and excited by what AI Purity is doing and the whole kind of explosion of advancements around generative AI. So thank you for the opportunity.
Thank you so much, David, for gracing our podcast, for the time and the valuable insights you've shared with us. And of course, thank you to everyone who has joined us today on another enlightening episode of the AI Purity Podcast. We hope you've enjoyed uncovering the mysteries of AI generated text and the cutting edge solutions offered by AI Purity. Stay tuned for more in depth discussions and exclusive insights into the world of artificial intelligence, text analysis, and beyond. Don't forget to visit our website, that's www.ai-purity.com, and share this podcast to spread the word about the remarkable possibilities that AI Purity offers. Until next time, keep exploring, keep innovating, and keep unmasking the AI. Thank you once again, David. Have a great day ahead.